Shane Sharp here, and now I want to discuss with you the social psychology of the self. As you've already learned, people are not born with self-concepts, which, to remind you, are the organized thoughts that people have about themselves. Rather, people's self-concepts are an outcome of the socialization process. According to social psychologists, people develop their self-concepts by taking on the role of the other, which is when people look at themselves through the eyes of others. It is through taking the role of the other that people learn what kind of people they are. Are they funny? Are they smart? Are they athletic? Are they bookish? Are they religious? Do they belong to a certain religion? Do they belong to a certain race? Do they belong to a certain gender? These are outcomes, in whole or in part, of being able to take on the role of the other. Self-concepts are made up of identities, which are the categories and roles people use to label themselves and define who they are. As we reviewed previously, people's self-concepts are made up of both personal identities, or the categories and roles people use to label and define themselves as unique individuals, and social identities, or the categories and roles people use to label and define themselves as members of social groups. Every person has a unique set of personal and social identities that make up their self-concepts. Numerous identities make up people's self-concepts. The identities in one person's self-concept could be a mother, a wife, a physician, a knitter, a Presbyterian, funny, friendly, intellectual, and adventurous. Because of the numerous identities that make up a person's self-concept, there are very few, if any, situations where all the identities that make up a person's self-concept would be relevant. In some situations, like a hospital, the most relevant identity might be physician. With friends, the most relevant identities might be funny and friendly. When interacting with family members, the wife or the mother identity might be the most relevant. When relaxing at home, the most relevant identity might be a knitter. Social psychologists call the set of identities that are prominent in a given situation the working self-concept. To use a perfect example, right now the most relevant part of my self-concept is a professor. It wouldn't make sense in this context that I am in right now to start acting in ways related to other identities that make up my self-concept, such as husband, brother, or father. Why do many social psychologists care about the makeup of people's self-concepts? Well, this isn't just an intellectual exercise for most social psychologists. Rather, social psychologists study the makeup of people's self-concepts because knowing the content of people's self-concepts can explain and predict people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings. As you'll see, social psychologists have found that people's self-concepts can explain and predict people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. Many social psychologists argue that people's self-concepts are highly influenced by the cultures in which they are raised. Social psychologists argue that people who are raised in Western cultures, such as the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, tend to have independent self-concepts. An independent self-concept is the conception of the self as an autonomous, independent person whose worth does not depend on others. People who have this type of self-concept believe that they are distinct persons despite social context and social relationships, and they find value in being distinct from everyone else. People with independent self-concepts tend to care more about personal achievement than social relationships, and they often draw hard and distinct boundaries between themselves and others. People with independent self-concepts have self-concepts that are dominated more by personal identities than social identities. For instance, a person with an independent self-concept would list more adjectives about themselves, such as funny, smart, ambitious, and hardworking, than labels that identify the social groups in which they belong, such as Christian or NIU student. On the other hand, people who are raised in non-Western cultures, such as China, Japan, India, and Nigeria, tend to have interdependent self-concepts. An interdependent self-concept is a conception of the self as a person who finds worth in social relationships and in fulfilling social obligations. People who have this type of self-concept believe that their worth and value comes from the relationships that they have with others, the social groups that they belong to, and from helping out the social groups in which they belong. People with an interdependent self-concept are more concerned with the feelings of others, tend to share more resources, feel dependent on fellow group members, and care more about the achievement of the group than personal achievement. People with interdependent self-concepts have self-concepts that are dominated more by social identities than personal identities. For instance, a person with an interdependent self-concept would list more social group labels, such as Christian or NIU student, than adjectives that make them seem unique, such as funny, smart, ambitious, and hardworking. Although there are many causes for these diverging types of self-concepts between individuals who live in Western cultures and individuals who live in non-Western cultures, social psychologists argue that one of the main reasons for the difference is variations of what values people in these different types of cultures are socialized to have. On the one hand, people in Western cultures tend to be taught the values of individualism, that a person is a unique person who can get by in the world by hard work and smarts alone, and who strives to stand out from the crowd. You can see this value in the American aphorism, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." On the other hand, people in non-Western cultures tend to be taught the values of collectivism, that a person is merely part of a larger whole, and success in life is defined as contributing to the common good. You can see this value in the East Asian saying, "The nail that stands out is the one that gets pounded down." Social psychologists also argue that there are gender differences in self-concepts in the United States. Men tend to have more of an independent self-concept, while women tend to have more of an interdependent self-concept. Social psychologists argue that this is mostly the result of differences in gender socialization in the United States. Boys tend to be socialized to be independent and to find their self-worth in their personal accomplishments, while girls tend to be socialized to be dependent and to find their self-worth through the relationships with others, boyfriends, husbands, children, or what have you. Social psychologists tend to visualize people's self-concepts as various identities arranged in a hierarchy according to salience. Salience is defined as the importance of a particular identity to a person. Say that a person has two social identities, a Christian and a yoga instructor. If the person's Christian identity is more important to the person than her yoga instructor identity, social psychologists would say that the Christian identity is more salient to the person than her yoga identity. Social psychologists argue that the salience of an identity is determined by a person's commitment to that identity. Furthermore, a person's commitment to an identity is determined by the number of important relationships that depend on having the particular identity. Going back to the hypothetical example of the Christian yoga instructor, this person is more committed to her Christian identity than to her yoga instructor identity if she were to lose more relationships with her significant others if she abandoned her Christian identity than if she were to abandon her yoga instructor identity. Here is a hypothetical representation of a self-concept of a typical female NIU undergraduate student in social psychology. The various identities, social psychology student, girlfriend, funny gal, and daughter, are in a hierarchy of salience, with social psychology student at the very bottom and daughter at the very top. The salience of these identities is based on the number of relationships with significant others this person would lose if she abandoned a particular identity, represented by the numbers in the parentheses. Social psychology student is lowest in the hierarchy because there are no relationships that the student would lose if she were to drop out of the course. Daughter is highest in the hierarchy because the student would lose many relationships with significant others if she were to abandon this identity, say by disowning her family. Now, self-concepts basically refer to what type of person people think they are. Funny, ambitious, Christian, black, Irish, or what have you. However, social psychologists also find that people have positive and negative judgments about their self-concepts, either in whole or in part, and these judgments cause people to feel particular emotions. When people judge their self-concepts in a positive manner, they feel positive emotions such as happiness and pride. However, when people judge their self-concepts in a negative manner, they feel negative emotions such as anger and sadness. Social psychologists call the positive and negative judgments and accompanying emotions that people have about their self-concepts self-esteem. Social psychologists say that people have high self-esteem when they have positive judgments about and experience positive emotions about their self-concepts. On the other hand, people have low self-esteem when they have negative judgments about and experience negative emotions about their self-concepts. In general, social psychologists assume that people want to maintain high self-esteem and avoid low self-esteem. Social psychologists also tend to distinguish between two general types of self-esteem: global self-esteem and domain self-esteem. Global self-esteem refers to the judgments and accompanying emotions people have about their overall self-concepts. In other words, global self-esteem is how people judge and feel about themselves in their entirety. Domain self-esteem refers to the judgments and accompanying emotions people have about specific identities within their self-concepts. In other words, domain self-esteem is how people judge and feel about their particular identities, such as brother, father, husband, Christian, electric worker, party animal, good guy, that make up their self-concepts. Social psychologists are also interested in how social experiences influence and affect people's self-esteem. Also, as you'll see, social psychologists argue that much of people's behavior related to their self-concepts is basically trying to maintain their self-esteem. Social psychologists argue that self-esteem serves two main functions for people: a sociometer function and an anxiety buffer function. The first function that self-esteem serves is what social psychologists call the sociometer function. With this function, self-esteem serves as a signal to people of the degree to which they are being included or excluded by other people. In other words, self-esteem is an indicator for people of social inclusion or exclusion. When people feel high self-esteem, they feel like they are being included in a group, and conversely, people feel low self-esteem when they feel they are being excluded from the group. This makes sense from an evolutionary social psychological perspective. Early humans who worked in groups were more likely to survive and reproduce than those who were more solitary. Thus, it was an evolutionary advantage to belong and stay in groups. Because of this, humans developed a psychological adaptation to signal to them their membership status in a group. And this psychological adaptation is self-esteem. The sociometer function of self-esteem was demonstrated in an experiment where people were put into a group or worked alone on a task. The experimenters told half of the people who worked alone that they were put into a group not because of other participants' preferences, but just randomly. And they told the other half of the people that they were going to work alone because others didn't want to work with them. The experimenters found that those who were told that they were working alone because others didn't want to work with them experienced lower self-esteem, while there was no change in self-esteem for those who were told that they were working alone because of random assignment. The second function that self-esteem serves is the anxiety buffer function. This function of self-esteem is used to lessen feelings of anxiety and fear by giving people a sense that they are a good person. Social psychologists argue that people tend to hold the belief that bad things don't happen to good people. So if people think they are good people, i.e., that they have high self-esteem, they will believe that bad things will not happen to them, which will decrease their anxiety. The anxiety buffer function of self-esteem was demonstrated in an experiment where the experimenters had participants watch the videos Faces of Death, which are a rather morbid set of videos that show people dying by falling off the top of buildings, being in car wrecks, or being electrocuted. The experimenters showed the participants these videos so that they would be reminded of their mortality and make them feel fear and anxiety. Before the experimenters showed the participants the videos, however, they gave half the participants positive feedback to increase their self-esteem and gave the other half neutral feedback. The results of the experiment showed that the participants who got positive feedback experienced less anxiety than those who got neutral feedback. In other words, the participants whose self-esteem was bolstered beforehand experienced less fear than participants whose self-esteem was not bolstered beforehand. Social psychologists find that people in general tend to have high self-esteem, despite the claims of pundits and self-help gurus that there is something of a low self-esteem epidemic in the United States. Social psychologists find that this is by no means the case. In fact, some social psychologists argue that many people suffer from the three illusions of self-esteem, which are defined as false or misleading positive judgments about one's self-concept. The three illusions of self-esteem are unrealistic positive views of self-concepts, unrealistic perceptions of personal control, and unrealistic optimism about the future. The first illusion of self-esteem that many people suffer from is unrealistic positive views of their self-concepts. Social psychologists have found that when given the chance to describe themselves using positive and negative adjectives, people overwhelmingly choose positive adjectives. Even when they do acknowledge negative aspects of their self-concepts, they often say that they are inconsequential. Furthermore, many people believe that the negative aspects of their self-concepts are shared by most others, but they believe that the positive aspects of their self-concepts are rare and distinguishing. Also, people view themselves more positively than the average person and believe that the average person has more negative aspects of their self-concept than they do. Because it is logically impossible for most people to be better than average, these overall positive views of the self indicate that many people have an overwhelmingly unrealistic positive view of themselves. Another piece of evidence that people have unrealistic positive views of their self-concepts is that people generally rate themselves more positively than objective observers do. The second illusion of self-esteem that many people suffer from is unrealistic perceptions of personal control. Social psychologists have found that people tend to overestimate the amount of control that they have over things. For instance, social psychologists have found that people believe that they have more control over a game whose outcomes are determined by chance than they actually have. This is why the gambling industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. People even believe that they have more control over the outcome of a roll of dice if they roll them than if someone else rolls them, which is completely nonsense. The third illusion of self-esteem that many people suffer from is unrealistic optimism about the future. Social psychologists find that many people believe that their futures will be much better than the present, even if they have no evidence to back it up. Also, people tend to believe that their futures will be more positive than others. And they also believe that others are more likely to experience negative events in the future than they are. In other words, people tend to believe that the future is bright and rosy, especially for them. Now, as I previously mentioned, social psychologists are interested in investigating self-concepts because they are interested in how self-concepts influence people's thinking, behavior, and emotions. Let's first discuss how self-concepts influence thinking. Social psychologists have found that people's self-concepts do influence their thinking. In particular, social psychologists have found that people's self-concepts influence their thinking in three major ways. The first major way that people's self-concepts influence their thinking is that people are more likely to pay attention to information that confirms their self-concepts. For example, if being a good student is an important part of a person's self-concept, then she will pay attention more to information that confirms her self-concept, such as positive feedback from her professor, and tend to ignore information that doesn't confirm her self-concept, such as negative feedback from her professor. The second major way that people's self-concepts influence their thinking is that people are more likely to remember information that confirms their self-concepts. For example, if being a superior athlete is an important part of a person's self-concept, then he will tend to remember incidences where he performed well athletically, but will tend to forget incidences where he performed poorly athletically. The third major way that people's self-concepts influence their thinking is that people are more likely to predict that they will act in ways in the future that will confirm their self-concepts. For example, if being a good mother is an important part of a person's self-concept, then that person will predict that she will also be a good mother in the future. Social psychologists are interested in how people's selves motivate their thinking. Overall, social psychologists have found that people's thinking is more motivated by self-enhancement than self-verification or self-assessment. Self-enhancement thinking is thinking that is motivated to maintain a positive view of oneself. Basically, this is a type of thinking that focuses on information that bolsters people's positive self-concepts and ignores or downplays any information that might lead to negative concepts. Self-verification thinking is thinking that is motivated to confirm the perception of oneself. Basically, this is a type of thinking where people focus on information that confirms what they already think of themselves and ignores or downplays information that doesn't confirm what people already think about themselves. Self-assessment thinking is thinking that is motivated to increase accurate knowledge about oneself. This is the type of thinking where people try to figure out what their actual abilities and characteristics are. Social psychologists find that the self-enhancement motive is the strongest, followed by the self-verification motive, and then the self-assessment motive. That is, people are motivated more to believe that their self-concepts are positive than they are motivated to verify what they believe about themselves or to accurately evaluate themselves. Because most people have high self-esteem, though, the self-enhancement motive and the self-verification motive often go hand in hand. For example, since most people already tend to have high regard for themselves, attending to information that verifies their self-concepts is at the same time thinking that enhances their self-concepts. The predominance of self-enhancement thinking may be the reason why many people don't seem to respond to criticism, constructive or otherwise. Because many people are motivated primarily by the need to enhance their self-concepts, they ignore or downplay criticisms that they receive and focus only on praise that they receive from others. Social psychologists also argue that a great deal of people's self-enhancement thinking is based on social comparisons. Social comparisons occur when people compare their abilities, performances, and characteristics to others in order to evaluate these abilities, performances, and characteristics. People often compare themselves to others because there is no objective criteria for evaluating many abilities, performances, and attributes. For example, consider artistic abilities. Often there is no objective, universally agreed upon criteria for determining who is actually a better painter, guitar player, photographer, or writer. In situations such as this, social psychologists find to evaluate their abilities, people will compare themselves to similar others in their social environments. Social psychologists find that, somewhat paradoxically, people use both downward and upward social comparisons to enhance their views of themselves. Downward social comparisons occur when people compare themselves to others who they believe are worse than they are in some way. By comparing themselves to others who are worse off than they are, people enhance their self-concepts. It's like saying, well, at least I'm not as bad or as bad off as he or she is. For example, one social psychological study found that breast cancer patients enhance themselves through downward social comparisons, saying that while they may have it bad, at least they didn't have it as bad as cancer patients who were in advanced stages of the disease or who were near death. Upward social comparisons occur when people compare themselves to others who they believe are better than they are in some way. For the most part, social psychologists find that people tend to avoid upward social comparisons because these types of comparisons often lead to negative views of the self. To use a drastic example, if I compared my basketball playing ability to that of LeBron James or Kevin Durant, that would not help me enhance my self-concept one bit. However, social psychologists do find that sometimes people use upward social comparisons to enhance their self-concepts. Through upward social comparisons, people perceive a similarity between themselves and the best, so to speak, and this helps enhance the self. For instance, if I truly believed that I was good at the game of basketball as LeBron James or Kevin Durant are, this might enhance my self-concept because I am putting myself in the same category as these very, very great basketball players. Not only do social psychologists argue that people's self-concepts influence their thinking, they also argue that people's self-concepts influence a great deal of their behavior. As you'll see, social psychologists argue that negative emotions such as fear, anger, and sadness explain much of this behavior. Social psychologists argue that the Salience hierarchy of identities that make up people's self-concepts influence their behavior in four main ways. The first way that the Salience hierarchy of identities influences behavior is that people are more likely to perform activities related to highly salient identities than less salient identities. For example, let's say that a person has two identities, student and evangelical Christian. And let's also say that the evangelical Christian identity is higher in the Salience hierarchy than the student identity. Social psychologists would predict that this person is more likely to perform behaviors related to her evangelical Christian identity, such as going to church, reading the Bible, and praying, than she is to perform behaviors related to her student identity, such as studying and doing her assigned readings. The second way that the Salience hierarchy of identities influences behavior is that people are more likely to see more situations as opportunities to perform behaviors associated with highly salient identities and see less opportunities to perform behaviors associated with identities of low salience. Going back to our hypothetical example, this person would see a variety of situations, such as a party or a ride on the train, as a place to preach the gospel to others. However, this same person would not see a party or the train as a place to perform behaviors related to her student identity, such as studying. The third way that the Salience hierarchy of identities influences behavior is that people are more active in seeking opportunities to perform behavior associated with highly salient identities than with identities of low salience. Going back to our hypothetical example, this person would seek out more opportunities to perform behavior associated with her Christian identity, such as going to church and listening to Christian radio, than she would for her student identity. The final way that the Salience hierarchy of identities influences behavior is that people are more likely to conform to the expectations of highly salient identities than they are to identities of low salience. Going back to our hypothetical example, this person would more likely conform to the expectations of an evangelical Christian, such as going to church and abstaining from premarital sex, and be less likely to conform to the expectations of a student. Social psychologists argue that much of people's behavior in regards to their self-concepts is motivated by wanting to maintain high self-esteem and to enhance one's self-concept. Social psychologists argue that when people's self-esteem is threatened, they often experience negative emotions such as fear, anger, and sadness, which motivate behavior. In other words, experiencing negative emotions or wanting to avoid experiencing negative emotions act as what scientists call mediating variables. A mediating variable is a variable that explains the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. Mediating variables are often called mechanisms. Here's how mediating variables work. First, you have the independent variable, which hopefully you'll remember is the variable causing a change in the dependent variable. In what scientists call mediated causation, the independent variable influences the dependent variable by causing some change in the mediating variable, and the change in the mediating variable causes the change in the dependent variable. Many social psychologists argue for a mediated causation model of how self-esteem influences behavior. Most social psychologists argue that threats to self-esteem cause people to experience negative emotions such as anger and sadness. These emotions, in turn, cause people to behave in certain ways in order to lessen their experiences of these negative emotions. Let's turn to some more specific examples of how threats to self-esteem influence people's behavior. Now, from time to time, people are going to have their positive self-concepts threatened in some way. A person who thinks she is a good student is going to receive a poor grade. A person who thinks he is a great quarterback is going to throw an interception. A person who thinks she is a good mother is going to say a hurtful thing to her child. Social psychologists argue that when people act in ways that threaten their positive self-concepts, they will experience negative emotions. The person who thinks she is a good student is going to experience shame for earning a poor grade. The person who thinks he is a great quarterback is going to experience shame for having thrown an interception. And the person who thinks she is a good mother is going to feel guilty for saying a hurtful thing to her child. Social psychologists further argue that these negative emotions motivate people to find some verification or recognition of their positive self-concepts in order to maintain their self-esteem. The good student will ask her friends or family members if they think she is a good student. The great quarterback will fish for compliments on his playing ability from his coach and teammates. And the good mother will try to do something kind for her child to get her child to respond to her as if she were a good mother. Once people receive some verification or recognition for their threatened positive self-concepts, they cease to experience negative emotions. Of course, there are cases where people cannot find some verification or recognition of an identity. For example, if a person believes he is a good poet, yet continues to write terrible poetry, his family, friends, writing instructors, and audience members at a poetry reading are not going to give this person any verification or recognition of this part of his self-concept. In cases where people cannot find some verification or recognition of an identity, social psychologists have found that people often drop this part of their self-concepts and focus their energy on parts of their self-concepts that they can verify and are recognized by others. For example, the bad poet is likely to drop the poet identity if he cannot verify this part of his self-concept and focus on other parts of his self-concept that he can verify, such as being good at physics or good at playing the saxophone. Social psychologists have also found that the motive to protect self-esteem influences people's social relationships. Social psychologists have found several ways that protecting self-esteem influences social relationships. First, social psychologists find that people tend to associate with others who recognize their positive self-concepts and avoid people who do not. Associating with people who recognize their positive self-concepts and avoiding those that don't helps people protect their self-esteem by excluding from one's social life others who might threaten one's self-esteem. For instance, if a person believes she is a good drummer, she is going to tend to associate with people who also believe that she is a good drummer and avoid associating with people who believe she isn't a good drummer. By doing so, she avoids the people that might challenge or question her drumming ability, thus helping her maintain her conception of herself as a good drummer. Social psychologists also find that people like to associate with others who have positive attributes and excel at activities that are not important to themselves personally, so that they can, what we call, bask in reflected glory. Basking in reflected glory consists of feelings of pride, happiness, and other positive emotions people experience by associating themselves with successful others. For example, say that a person who really doesn't care that he can't play guitar has a girlfriend that is really good at playing guitar. In this case, the boyfriend will bask in the reflected glory of his girlfriend, feeling positive emotions. Social psychologists have found that many Americans bask in the reflected glory of college and professional sports teams. For example, social psychologists have found that students at a university are more likely to wear clothes with the college logo on them the Monday after the team wins a football game than they are when the football team loses. Social psychologists have also found that people are more likely to use the pronoun we when talking about their favorite team when the team wins, but are more likely to use the pronoun them when their favorite team loses. People use the pronoun we when the team wins so they can bask in the team's reflected glory by associating themselves with the team. However, since there is no glory to reflect when the team loses, people use the pronoun them to disassociate themselves from the team. There are times, however, when significant others in a person's life also have the same positive attributes or are good at the activities that are also important for this person's self-concept and self-esteem. An example of this is when a person thinks he is a good painter, but has a best friend who is also a good painter. What do people do in these situations? Social psychologists find that people tend to perform one of 4 actions when significant others have the same positive attributes or excel at the same activities that are important for people's self-concepts. The first action that people tend to perform when a significant other has attributes or performs well at an activity that is important to their self-concepts is try to improve these abilities or become better at these activities. For example, the person who thinks he is a good guitar player may begin to practice more or take more music lessons in order to match his skills to his best friend's. People usually take this action when they perceive that a significant other's attributes or performances are just slightly better than their attributes or performances. The second action that people tend to perform when a significant other has attributes or performs well at an activity that is important to their self-concepts is to make the attributes or activities less important to themselves. For example, the person who thinks he is a good guitar player may begin to tell himself that playing the guitar well is really not all that important to him. People usually take this action when maintaining a relationship with a significant other is very important to a person, and when the importance of the attribute or performance is important, but not too important. Also, once people make the attribute or performance unimportant to themselves, they can bask in the reflected glory of their significant other. Once the person makes playing the guitar unimportant to his self-concept, he can now bask in the reflected glory of his best friend's talents. The third action that people tend to perform when a significant other has attributes or performs well at an activity that is important to their self-concepts is to distance themselves from these significant others. For example, the person who thinks he is a good guitar player may stop associating with his best friend and end the relationship with him. People usually take this action when the attributes or activities are more important to a person than maintaining the relationship with the significant other. The fourth action that people tend to perform when a significant other has attributes or performs well at an activity that is important to their self-concepts is to sabotage or negatively influence the attributes or performances of significant others. For example, the person who thinks he is a good guitar player may try to sabotage his friend in some way so that he doesn't seem like such a great guitar player, like tuning his strings before a performance. People usually take this action when a person can influence the attributes or performances of a significant other. The final topic I want to talk about in this lecture is the relationship between self-esteem and violent behavior. For a long time, many people, social psychologists included, believed that people with low self-esteem committed more violence than people with high self-esteem. It was thought that people with low self-esteem lashed out, so to speak, at others because of their low self-esteem. Social psychologists, however, have found just the opposite. That is, people with high self-esteem tend to be more violent than those with low self-esteem. For example, social psychologists and criminologists tend to find that people convicted of violent crimes, such as murder and rape, tend to have high self-esteem. Also, many abusive husbands have high self-esteem, contrary to what many people believe. Why are people with high self-esteem more prone to commit violent behavior? Social psychologists argue that the motive to maintain high self-esteem is what actually causes many people to commit acts of violence against others. Because people want to maintain high self-esteem, they sometimes act aggressively towards others who threaten their self-esteem. This aggression is caused by the fear and anger people experience when self-esteem is threatened. For example, one social psychologist who studied rape perpetrators found that threats to the rapist's self-esteem preceded the rape. And some social psychologists explained this finding by saying that the rape somehow lessened the negative emotions by giving the rapist a sense of power over another. Social psychologists also argue that people use aggression to punish the person that threatened their self-esteem, discouraging the person from further threatening their self-esteem, and to bolster self-esteem by establishing dominance over another. These motives are clearly seen when we look at the case of domestic violence perpetrators. Several social psychologists have found that many domestic violence perpetrators have overly high self-esteem. Because they have overly high self-esteem, partners often threaten this self-esteem through their words and actions. Several social psychologists argue that domestic violence perpetrators use violence to punish their partners for threatening their self-esteem and to prevent their partners from doing it in the future. Furthermore, violence against a partner establishes dominance over the partner, which bolsters the self-esteem of domestic violence perpetrators by giving them a sense of power over another.